If you've done some previous work in relation to strategic roles, you may have come across multiple sets of terminology. Some people reference strategic roles, while others use the terms critical roles or pivotal roles. All of these terms reference the exact same thing. They identify the key roles within the company, i.e. those roles which matter most to the success of the business. The final term, roles of interest, is one that I created. Why do I say determine the roles of interest when the more popular convention is to say determine the critical or pivotal roles? The answer to this question is related to corporate culture. If your company operates in silos, as many large companies do, there is a tendency for the leaders of each silo to view his or her area as the most important and to view the majority of the roles within his or her organization as critical. In fact, in one large global company, an attempt several years ago to define the critical roles at the leadership level resulted in all but one position being classified as critical. When holding discussions with business leaders to determine the strategic roles within the company, I knew that if I used any of the first three, I would not get an unbiased discussion. Human nature with the first three labels are such that people will be biased in their discussions because they want to get their own jobs or organization on the list of strategic roles. Especially in companies currently experiencing financial challenges, people will assume that if they cannot get onto the list of strategic roles, that they are automatically on the potential downsizing or redundancy list. I have found that using the term roles of interest allows for a less biased discussion because that list is used for far more discussions than who to avoid when downsizing. So for the remainder of this course, I will reference roles of interest. In your own company, feel free to use the most appropriate term. Acceptance of each term will really be a function of the personalities and understanding of your leaders. So what does it mean to determine roles of interest? What we're really talking about is role segmentation. Segmentation means that we are dividing the job roles inside a company into separate groups so we can focus our efforts more on the roles that matter the most. The roles of interest in an organization are the ones required to successfully accomplish these strategic objectives. Strategic objectives are defined by the business strategy. Looking at the roles in an organization, why else would we want to segment the roles or determine the roles of interest? For most companies, there would be little value in dedicating resources to analyzing roles that are not critical or pivotal to your company. Therefore, this activity is designed to focus the efforts of your staff, which in most companies is your human resources staff, on roles that matter the most and where changes to these roles yield the most value. When we focus in on the strategic roles, it means we are going to dedicate more time and budget on these roles. Additionally, looking at all of the roles is impractical. There is no human resources department out there that has so many available resources and budget to spend their time examining all roles in depth. As a final thought, as we head into looking at the specific methods for performing this activity, it is important to note that we are studying the roles in the company, not the individual people in those roles. As we work our way through the rest of this material, what I'm going to actually show you are 7 different methods for determining roles of interest within your company. Each of these methods is described in a little more detail in a book entitled Strategic Workforce Planning, Guidance and Backup Plans. A description of this book can be found later in this course. Now, the first 6 methods that I'm going to show you are from public literature searches, conference presentations, and books that I've read while I did my own research. The 7th method is actually my own adaptation where I've taken the best pieces of each of the first 6 methods and combined them into a method of my own. As we go through 7 different methods, what I'd like you to do is think about your company and determine which method you think would work best within your organization and organizational culture. If you found the previous slide a little confusing, here is a simpler explanation. Your company has a business strategy. The business strategy determines what the strategic objectives are for the company, i.e. what the business wants to accomplish in order to grow or remain competitive and successful. How different roles in a company are linked to these strategic objectives contributes to determining whether they are strategic roles. This method has a certain elegance in its simplicity. For each role, plot the importance to the business along one axis and the level of difficulty in obtaining that talent along the other axis. The more important the role is to the business, the further to the right it goes on the chart. The more difficult it is to hire for that position, the further up the chart it goes. As an example, suppose you have an HR position which is very tactical. Perhaps the job role reviews administrative paperwork of some sort. Perhaps the work is very repetitive and doesn't require specialized knowledge on whatever that administrative topic may be. Likely the level of importance of that function is fairly low to the business. The skill sets of that position are likely not very specialized and probably easier to find in the market. This role would be placed in the bottom left area of the 2x2 matrix. Let's look at a more strategic role in human resources. We'll use my former role as an example. On an org chart, I reported directly to the Vice President of Human Resources. I led global projects for HR. If I were to gather together the HR leaders, they might determine that my role is important to the business because it is linked to the HR strategy. And chances are, my role would require specialized skills that are less available in the market. They would likely place this position in the upper right corner of the matrix. Pause this video to take a moment to think about this role. Do you agree with the HR leaders? Let's take a closer look at this role. In this example, I gathered together the leaders in HR to do the assessment. Their natural tendency would be to view my role only from a human resources perspective. I've intentionally given this example to illustrate how important it is to gather together a cross-functional team to perform this activity. This ensures that the assessment is done from an overall business view and not the view within one functional area. So, considering my former job role again, I'll add the information that this was for a company that delivers packages for customers. From the overall business perspective, even if my job role disappeared tomorrow from the company, would customers still receive their packages the next day? Of course they would. So in my opinion, while the role was certainly strategic within human resources, it is not as strategic when viewed from the overall business perspective. What do you think happens to companies that only do this assessment within their own functional area? You will likely end up with a much longer list of strategic positions than you should. The risk is that the list becomes so long that it's still too many for human resources to focus on. So, once a proper assessment has been completed, the positions ending up in the upper right corner of the matrix would be your highest priority for a variety of business actions. I will give examples of possible actions later in this course. These would be specific examples of what companies are using the strategic position information for. The disadvantage of this method is that it isn't forward-looking. It's assessing the role today. That's okay if your positions don't change in terms of competencies and skill sets over the next few years, but if they do, you need to map what these positions will be rather than what they are today. Now I've grouped the second method in with the first one because it's actually very similar. This time the two factors are how critical the position is and the level of complexity. This method looks at whether the role impacts financial results, the complexity of working across organizational boundaries, whether it develops a business strategy, and the range of skills required. When we compare this method to the previous one, we see that they are very similar. Likely a job of high complexity will require skill sets that are less likely to be available in the market. And the more critical a job is to the company, the more important it is to the business. These are essentially the same thing. If you were looking to determine which of these two methods to use within your own company, since they will likely yield the exact same results, select the method which uses terminology with which your leaders would be most comfortable. As one final example, consider the following. It's 1995. You're an IT programmer writing COBOL and Fortran code for a fabulous tech company. Where would you place this job role on the 2x2 grid back in 1995? Where would you place this job role on the 2x2 grid today? Where should you place this job role on the 2x2 grid for tomorrow? The point I'm trying to make here is that IT and technology jobs are the most obvious areas where you need to think about what the job needs to be in the future before you place it on the grid. The skill sets in these job roles move so rapidly that consideration of what they may look like in the future is the most important consideration when evaluating these roles. This next method is a bit different than the previous two. It segments the roles in the organization in terms of the strength of their link to the business strategy. Roles that drive the strategy are called strategic. That makes sense, right? Roles that support the strategy are called core. They are strategic but are a bit further away from actually driving or executing the strategy. The remaining two categories are not strategic and are grouped as to whether or not they are necessary. A good thing about this method is that it also recommends an action associated with the position. Strategic roles should be strengthened, whereas misaligned positions should be eliminated. What I like about this method is that it has a strong link to the business strategy, which is something that is missing in some of the previous methods. One downside to this method is that it is not explicitly forward-looking, which was the same disadvantage to the previous methods we looked at. So you have to be careful to use this method with future roles in mind and not how they are today. Again, this mostly impacts roles that have changing competencies over the next few years. In the previous video, we saw that IT and technology jobs are good examples of these roles. This method is from an organization called the Human Capital Institute. It's fairly similar to the previous method in that it groups roles into 4 categories, from those linked to the business strategy down to those which are misaligned. This method also gives a rough percentage of the roles in each category. I think you may see more than 15% critical roles if you're in a fast-moving tech company with heavy R&D, so research and development. But for most of us, these percentages should be a pretty good ballpark. There are some key questions that HCI recommends for this method. Which roles contribute more to strategic execution? Which roles have the potential to accelerate achievement of the business strategy? Which competencies are vital to executing the business strategy? So the Human Capital Institute recommends in this method to keep those questions in mind. Have you heard of or read a book called The Differentiated Workforce? This book has a method which is a bit more complex, so this is method number 5 in this course. It starts with 2 key questions. How will we compete? What must we do exceptionally well to win? Based on this, you identify the strategic capabilities in your company, not the strategic roles. Then, the strategic roles are defined as those positions with strategic capabilities that also have a large variation in performance. The logic behind this is that those strategic positions which have larger performance variations have greater opportunity for improvement, i.e., improvement in these roles will yield the biggest improvement impact for the business. I like the strong linkage to competitive advantage in this method and the fact that this method is forward-looking, whereas the first few methods we examined were not. The only downside is that it may be a bit complex for implementation depending on your leadership. Remember, whichever method you select, you will need to explain it to the team which will perform the assessment activity. If they can't understand the method, the activity will not get off to a good start. If you think your leadership would be more successful with a simpler method, then I recommend selecting from methods 1 or 2. Have you heard of or read the book called Beyond HR? It is similar in concept to the method outlined in the differentiated workforce in that it seeks to find where improvements in performance most enhance strategic success. Specific questions for this method are: what resources do you have that your competitors would most like to have? Where would more or better people have the greatest effect? So again, this method searches for the roles in the company which are both strategic and have opportunity for improvement. Like the previous method, it can be a bit complex for some companies to successfully use, but it has been done successfully. Not quite wanting to use any of the previous methods in their entirety, this final method is one I created. It takes what I consider to be the best pieces of several of the methods and attempts to address some of the disadvantages in some of the methods. I've divided the method into three main categories. The first category is related to the business objectives. The next is related to strengths we have and need to keep in the company. The third is related to the skills we need to have for the future. This future section was created to address the fact that many of these methods assessed only the present, which doesn't account for rapidly changing skill sets. Once we identify the roles related to each of the three categories, we have our first draft of our roles of interest list or strategic role list. For larger companies, you can see that this may produce a fairly long list. If the list is too long for the resources we have available to focus on these roles, then I have a second section of the form related to prioritizations. That second section is not shown here, but is used to prioritize the draft list in terms of items like whether they have a strong financial impact to the company. This helps to narrow the list down to a manageable length. Let's switch gears for just a moment and look at a popular mistake that companies are making when trying to determine the roles of interest. Some companies divide their workforce by reporting level and then say that everyone on the organizational chart at a certain level or higher is in a strategic role. This isn't a strategic approach because it doesn't focus on the value that each role provides to the business. It doesn't consider the business outcomes related to each role. Segmentation should be based on items we've discussed in some of the models, such as uniqueness of skills and what the role contributes to the success of the business. Some categories of value might include contributions to revenue generation, cost management, contribution to efficiency gains, and risk management. It is very possible to have a leadership position which does not require a high level of uniqueness in skill sets.